Hello my friends, so here we are, A Look in the Dark, chapter 15, Irish Secrets, and this is the first episode of that particular chapter. It's set, most of this chapter, in Ireland, not far from where we live actually, up here at the top of Ireland. Just in the north, not quite over the border into the Irish Republic in the county of Donegal. And also in this chapter, this book appears. It is mentioned. How would that be? Well, let's find out. You remember that Paul Hanlon had agreed to help them, and this concerns Paul Hanlon and his desire to help them find out what they needed to know. Dylan followed his master down over the hill from Tully Whisker toward Claddie. The after-dawn sunshine was now doing more than lighten the edges of the clouds with a red fringe. Now the night showers gave the greens and browns along each side of the road a polished finish, almost as if everything had been renovated in the night. Well, Dylan, isn't it great to be alive and to know the nighttime mission was successful? The dog looked up at his master in response to the cheerful comment, and had there been an observer, they wouldn't have believed that these two creatures bouncing along the road had been out all night and covered a lot of miles, and that they carried very important information. The birds were really starting to move about now. The cattle in the field along the Tullymone Road were moving away from the hedgerow to the middle of their current residing place, deciding to benefit from some of the morning's solar energy. Paul stopped to count the animals. Rourke, he's doing all right, Dylan. More and more cattle all the time. Ask him how he's doing and he'll say, terrible. That's despite the new car and the new tractor. Well, come on, boy. Let's get home and phone young Danny Green before he goes out, and then we'll sort out some breakfast and a good long sleep, though I feel fit enough to go and fight an orange band. Paul reflected on his night's work. A success it had certainly proved to be, and much easier than he thought it might be. Young Davy had been easy enough to ply with drink, and when Paul had expressed a desire to see what Davy's uncle had done with the inside of the house, he received an instant invitation. The walk from the bar to the house called Crawley had been a problem. Davy was already fairly well lubricated internally, and Paul had out of necessity drunk a little more than was usual in order to point his companion in the right direction. A taxi would have been easier, but Paul wanted to keep it to themselves that he'd been a visitor to this house that nobody ever got into. He felt certain that young Davy would not be mentioning that he'd brought a stranger in while his uncle was absent. But here everyone knew everyone else, and could a taxi driver be trusted? When they arrived at the house, the fresh air had helped to sober Davy up a bit. Paul was glad that he'd brought a bottle of Irish whiskey before leaving the bar. Once inside the adequate lounge of Crawley, he put the bottle on the coffee table. Davy pointed to the glasses on the shelf of a wall unit, and Paul made sure that while he sipped one small glass, Davy drank 3 large glasses. As the poor young alcoholic sank into a deep sleep, Paul refilled his glass, feeling certain that if he awoke, Davy would just reach for more of his favourite potion. Leaving the bottle by the glass was as good as leaving an armed guard, because there was no way that this unfortunate lad would get past that bottle. Right, Dylan, he addressed the dog in all seriousness. You stay here and watch over Davy while I find the bathroom. He did indeed find the bathroom, but then, having checked that he could still hear the deep, slumbering and weighty breathing of his friend, Paul started to look around the house. He soon found the office, which was on the ground floor and was surprisingly tidy, not like the outside yard. Here in the office there was some kind of order. He flicked through the papers on the desk, but they seemed to relate to sheep, car parts, and the Bank of Ireland. He started to look in the desk drawers, but there was only office supplies and a phone directory, a copy of Republican News, and a book about vintage tractors. Above the desk there was a shelf, mostly covered with books about wildlife and birds. He lifted a few of the books down, a couple at a time, and behind a copy of Reader's Digest Book of Birds, and Birds of the British Isles and Their Eggs, which he would have liked to have taken home, he found a plastic box. It was a small box, and when Paul opened it, he found a number of index cards. Each card contained a name and a phone number, and most of them had an address as well. Beneath this was information about birds, sometimes animals. This like the records he'd hoped to find. So after checking from the hallway that the slow rhythmic breathing from the drunken man continued, and being reassured by loud snoring, Paul sat at the desk with his discovery, took a pen and notebook out of his inside pocket, and started to write it all down. There were about 50 cards, but some contained only a little information. A few contained much more, but Paul just kept writing until he had a copy of everything in that little blue index box. He checked around to see if there was anything else in the room that was of interest, but he appeared to have what there was there. He wondered, though, as he looked along the line of books, that a man could have such a library when his purpose was to exploit the natural world. Such thinking was alien to Paul, and he just couldn't imagine leafing through those pages to do damage rather than to learn and benefit. It was then that he noticed what he thought was just a stool in a corner, but now he realised it was a piano stool. So he lifted the lid. Inside the stall there was storage space with a lot of papers, and some of them were bills for utility companies. But underneath this wad of paper was a diary for the year 1984. It had a few entries for each month, and these included a name, a phone number and a page number, all written in black, but at the bottom of each page there was another entry in red. As an example, this is how the page for March the 10th looked. You can see it there, my friends. Do you see the writing there? Have you got that? So there it was on the page, the phone number. Then there was a page number and then another page number on this one, and in red 1500. Paul wasn't sure about this at first, but the page number seemed to represent something, some kind of clue. He looked along the bookcase. After trying 3 field guides, he came to the Birds of Britain and Europe, published by Collins. Using the above entry at random, he turned to page 76, and the first entry on the page, which fitted with what was written, there was the text and the picture for a buzzard. He then tried page 86, and the second entry. This took him to Hen Harrier. He thought about the diary. Would it be missed? Possibly, but how could it ever be traced to him? He wrote in his notebook the title of the field guide with details of the compilers, Heinzel, Fitter, Parslow, 1984 edition. Then he placed the book back on its place on the shelf and placed the diary and the notebook in his pocket. He looked around to make sure all was as he'd found it, and then he returned to the room where Dylan lay across Davy's legs and the two of them were sleeping. He gently roused Dylan, decided that he would leave Davy the whiskey and headed to the back door. As he opened it up, he noticed a biscuit barrel and took a few biscuits out. Just to keep us going, Dylan. Small price, considering what I paid for all that booze. As they made their way in the dark, down the bumpy track to the road, the moan of a long-eared owl added atmosphere to their journey. So now, 2 hours later, as they neared home on that sparkling, wet and dry morning, Paul felt a deep sense of satisfaction at a truly useful evening's work. He opened the gate for Dylan, who was wagging his tail with delight, because his master was so happy. As he entered the house, the old clock inherited from Grandfather Hanlon announced that it was 7:35 a.m, so Paul was set to wondering, was it too early to telephone the Greens? But he reasoned that they were staying on a farm and someone would be up. He made a cup of tea and poured some for Dylan in his bowl and some for himself, and then he sat down with the phone, feeling pleased with himself. As he dialed the number, he felt the pleasure that comes with knowing you're going to make someone's day. 2 rings and the connection was acknowledged. And 50 miles away from Paul's home, Danny Green heard his father-in-law say, "Who will I say is calling him?" Then, "It's for you, Danny, about your writing. A man called Paul." "Great, I'll take it in the hall." "Hello, Paul. How you doing, Danny?" "Fine, you all right?" "Oh, aye. And you'll be even finer when I tell you I have the information you wanted." "That's fantastic. I won't ask you how." "I'll tell you when I see you. When can I come down?" "Well, we'd planned to do some fishing of our own today, but..." No, you go ahead. Dylan and I did all this on the night shift and we walked each way. Poor Dylan is about on his belly and I'm just a bit behind him. We both need some kip. What about tomorrow?" Excuse me. "Yeah, that would do. Will we come up to you?" "Not a good idea. We shouldn't be seen together around here, especially if young Davy saw us. I'll bring what I have to you. Anyway, I'd like to see how farmers care for their herds in South Tyrone. I'm sure that could be arranged. What time would you want to be here? I could be there by 9:30 in the morning, without annoying myself too much, but you'd best give me directions, Danny. Carol, in the kitchen, was drying the breakfast dishes as her mother washed them. So you see, Mummy, there's a problem, and there has been for years. Danny was showing me a book the other night by a famous British naturalist called W.H. Hudson. I know him, daughter. Carol was surprised by her father's interruption. She'd forgotten how his morning read of the newsletter didn't mean he was ignoring the conversation. How do you know him, though? He was born in Argentina, I think. I read a book of his. It's on the bookshelf there. A Shepherd's Life, all about shepherds in times past, down near where you and Danny live. Great wee book. Danny would be interested in that. Anyway, he wrote a book called Lost British Birds, and in it he says that the St Kilda wren on the Outer Hebrides was extinct. And he blamed it on the collectors. That was in the 1890s. He was wrong because the St Kilda wren did survive, but it was no thanks to the collectors. Davy re-entered the room. I'm just talking to Ma and Dara about the St Kilda's wren, Dan. Mr Irving nodded at Danny. Tell Linda what you were saying about the great auk when we were working in the yard, Danny. Well, they used to be really numerous. They were killed for years for food, but later for their feathers. Last one definitely known to be killed was on Iceland in 1844. Trouble is, once it was getting really scarce, the collectors became more determined to have one, so they offered more money for it, thus hastening its extinction. An ornithologist claimed to see one in 1852, but nobody has seen one anywhere since. You might as well say, scarce as a great auk, as dead as a dodo. In the end, it all comes down to plain greed and ruthlessness. The spectacled crane is another. Not observed since the 1850s, totally unknown since, hunted to oblivion, and who can ever get it back again? I know it's not good, Danny, so where will it end? Linda Irvine was interested. She cared about animals and birds, even if she wasn't passionate about them. So this writing you're doing, Danny, is it connected to this threat to wildlife? Is that right? Yes, but we don't want that to be commonly known just yet, not for a few weeks anyway. Are we going to Belfast this morning then, Carol? Aye, Danny boy, get yourself ready and I'll show you a bit more of the best country in the world. Carol winked at her mother, who took comfort in her daughter's love of Ulster, but she may have been less pleased had she known that her daughter meant the whole of Ireland, not 6, but all 32 counties. Soon, Danny and Carol were on the M1 heading for Belfast. Once they got there, they decided to take a break before going and seeking out Jimmy Kendall. They wanted to retrace a romantic walk they'd once enjoyed at Shaw's Bridge along the River Lagan and in one of the rural parts of the city. It was here, as Carol watched Danny enthusing about a grey wagtail on a rock in the river, that Carol had concluded that he really was the only man she could marry. They'd not been to Shaw's Bridge since, and that was about 7 years before this visit. As they walked along the path enjoying the late morning sunshine, their peace was shattered by the sound of wailing sirens from further into the city. This was followed a few moments later by the loud crump of an explosion. Black smoke poured upward into the air, and Carol estimated that the bomb was not far from the centre of Belfast. The sound of more sirens and the hovering helicopter completed the picture of what was not so unusual in the 1980s, any day in Northern Ireland's capital. Well, Carol, what's that all about? Danny pointed in the direction of the smoke. Well, Dan, friend Sean on the Tyrone border would say it's a blow for Irish freedom. On the other hand, my father would say it's an attack on his right to be British. Me, I don't know. It's another burned out building, and I hope it stops soon. It has all got to do with time, really. Aye, like you've got 10 minutes to get out. Danny attempted an Irish accent. But seriously, Dan, you know what I said before about time being like a rope? Our generation have got hold of the rope and we can take it in whatever direction we choose. But as we pull it forward, it's always coming from the direction that other generations took it in. As it gets dragged forward, it's threaded through more and more problems, and bits of the past keep coming up the rope, affecting the present and the future. Seems a good illustration of it, Carol. I don't know, Dan, but when I think of it that way, it makes me want to try and pull things in a way that's helping future generations, not endlessly stirring up the same old problems. Yeah, well, we're trying to do that with this investigation of ours. is going to come to a head soon, you know. We're just touching the surface, getting an idea of the scope of it. In the not distant future, we're going to have to hand it over to the professionals. So, there we are, my friends, Danny and Carol, engaged in their mission, but with the help of Paul Hanlon, who took quite a risk in order to get them some vital information, which adds to the overall picture. And in the meantime, of course, Ricky Claymore's doing some investigating of his own down in Hampshire and Wiltshire. So things are going to start coming together, and they're going to have enough to present it to the authorities. That's where things are heading. But there are events to happen yet. And of course, there's the backdrop of Northern Ireland in the 1980s. It was a sad time in many ways. And we know the answer to all those things, don't we, my friends? It's nice to share the story with you, and thank you for continuing to listen, and I hope you're enjoying it. And if you have any comments or anything you feel about it, I'd be interested in your thoughts. But in the meantime, Kate would like me to send her love to all of you with mine, and to wish you all peace, which in sign language here is peace. Bye bye, my friends. Bye bye.